So big thanks, first of all, to Juliet and Chrissy and Dee from BISA for putting all the labour into making this happen. I should say I co-convene the CPD working group along with Nivi Manchanda, Koram and also Gargi Bhattacharya. So it's very much a collective exercise. And we put together this event really to speak to this context in which we have these articulated and deeply related crises. So in the UK at the moment, Black people are 3 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than white people in this broader context in which we have one of the highest COVID death rates in the world. And then obviously we've had this devastating daylight murder of George Floyd in the US, which reminds people here that we've also had hundreds of deaths in custody in the UK in recent years and no convictions for police killings since the 1960s. And of course, Black people are overrepresented in those figures. And of course, all of this is just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger system of racial oppression. But our conversation today is really about the movement which has been reinvigorated in this contemporary context, the Black Lives Matter movement, and how it's actually shifting the horizon of possibility in terms of justice and abolition, and also how it sits within the more expansive histories of Black struggle, from, you know, going way back to the Haitian Revolution, other slave revolts, through anti-colonialism, civil rights struggles, and so on. So obviously, because this is an international studies space, we're particularly interested in how Black struggle and visions for social life have shaped the international as a whole and expanded its terrains and notions of justice and rights and equality, and so on. So to reflect on all of this, we have 3 of the most important rising intellectuals working in the UK context. Dr Olivia Rutazibwa, she is senior lecturer in international development and European studies at Portsmouth. She's published multiple articles, journal articles, and she co-edited the wonderful Routledge Handbook of Postcolonial Politics. I'm just going to do this. And Olivia is also a really important voice in the Belgian context, where she contributes work on race and racism. And she's actually currently joining us from South Africa, where she's doing a visiting fellowship, hence the palatial surroundings. So we also have Adam Elliott-Cooper. Adam did his PhD at Oxford and has since held positions at Warwick and UCL and King's, and is now a researcher at Greenwich. And Adam recently published a really brilliant article in Antipode on gender and Black resistance. And he's become a really vital voice in the media on race and racism as well. And finally, Kojo Koram. I'm really proud to say Kojo is my colleague at Birkbeck. He's lecturer in law, and his core scholarly work deals with drugs legislation. And I'm going to do the cheesy book thing again. His wonderful book, The War on Drugs and the Global Colour Line, came out last year. Really brilliant text. And his most recent journal article in the London Review of International Law dealt with the question of sacrificial international law. So he's someone who's always thinking about this question of the international. So really important for this conversation. So all of our speakers have contributed so much to Black struggle intellectually and politically. And so we're beyond thrilled to have you all with us. So I'm just going to go ahead with a few questions, and if members of the audience have questions, please just type them in the chat box and we'll get through as many as we can towards the end. All right, so the first question, I'm going to start actually by going back to a text written in 1992 by the wonderful Jamaican scholar Sylvia Wynter. And this text is titled "No Humans Involved, an open letter to my colleagues." And Sylvia Wynter writes this text in response to the Rodney King beating. And in light of the revelation that, to quote her directly in this, she says public officials of the judicial system of Los Angeles routinely use the acronym NHI to refer to any case involving a breach of the rights of young Black males. And NHI means no humans involved. So this strikes a particular chord for Wynter because most of her incredible body of work thrashes over and over this important question of who is included in representations of the human, who is overrepresented in that figure, and who is excluded entirely from the category, and as a result excluded from ethical treatment and justice. So in this essay, she calls out the no humans involved classificatory schema and the racist violence that it actually sanctions. And she ends the essay by proposing, to quote her again, a new frontier of knowledge able to move us toward a new correlated human species, an ecosystemic ethic. So I just wanted to start by thinking about Wynter's 1992 appeal, and to ask, how far does this call for a new knowledge still resonate with you today? Does it speak to unfinished business? And to follow that up, how far has Black struggle shifted and expanded both its vocabularies and its horizons since then, so beyond representation onto broader questions? So if I could direct that first to Adam, that would be great. Chrissy, Adam can't unmute himself, I don't think.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. I think that's a really interesting place to start our discussions around this idea of the notion of the human, but also about, I guess, Black discourse and Black radical discourse and how we understand race and racism today. Because I think that it's a really interesting moment, because the young people, and it's mainly young people who have organised and led these, you know, the largest anti-racist protests in British history, and certainly the largest in the United States since the 1960s, and of course in many other parts of Europe and elsewhere as well. And I think it's remarkable that it's young people who are leading these protests, because these are young people who were barely teenagers when Black Lives Matter became a popular slogan. Right? These are people who were maybe 12 or 13 years old when this phrase became popularized following the killing of Trayvon Martin. And so these people haven't lived in a world in which Black Lives Matter isn't a slogan, which in some ways is quite aging, but I think it's quite remarkable, because the other thing, of course, I think that they've grown up in is a world in which the President of the United States has also been a Black person. And that hasn't been enough. And all of the promises and the overtures for a Black presidency and therefore Black representation, whilst that was kind of done away with, and those conversations were already kind of had in the global South following Fanos and others' real violent criticisms of representational politics across Africa and elsewhere. Those conversations were really reaffirmed, I think, after the failures of the Obama administration to do anything substantive in ameliorating the racisms of the United States, and which I think the dissatisfaction of this is what led to Black Lives Matter being a slogan. But there are also criticisms, of course, of the phrase Black Lives Matter, because the slogan of the 1960s wasn't Black Lives Matter. It was Black Power. And I think incumbent on us to think critically and to interrogate what the difference is between using the slogan Black Lives Matter and using the slogan Black Power, and what one means and what the other means, and whether Black Lives Matter isn't enough, and whether we should be using a slogan which demands more, which doesn't just demand that Black lives do matter, but demands for Black power, demands for Black liberation, demands for a revolutionary reckoning with the problems of racism, and white supremacy. But saying that, despite the fact that some people might argue that Black Lives Matter isn't as strong or as radical a slogan as previous as the call for Black Power, this certainly isn't the case when we see the demands of these movements and the revolutionary calls against capitalism, imperialism, against prisons and police, all of these things, and not to mention the reaffirmation of Black queer and Black feminist politics in these new movements as well, I think demonstrates that whilst the slogan could be criticised in relation to the 1960s equivalents, what we're demanding is certainly building on those struggles of previous decades and bringing them forward.
Great, thank you, Adam. Olivia, do you want to follow up at all on that?
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, great. Yeah, I was reading that question and also really liked it. And maybe first to follow up on this idea of Black Lives Matters versus Black Power. I think it's a powerful way to try and think, what is it that we're doing similarly or asking similarly, or what is it that is different? And I think the most exasperating thing is realizing that in 2020, that slogan of Black Lives Matter still, like, for me, it's like the basic minimum to some extent, right? It's almost obscene that still needs to be somehow affirmed. So in that way, I know it's uncomfortable sometimes even to have to use that slogan. On the other hand, for me personally, I think it also has allowed for a language in which we can more quickly explain that racism is not about stereotypes and saying nasty stuff and whatever, but that it's really something about life and death. So in that sense, I think, and like Adam said, there is a lot of really radical content to Black Lives Matters, but the reason why so many self-discovered progressive people are using it now is not necessarily for the radical stuff, but because it feels unthreatening to say Black Lives Matters, because it's, so, but I think, we're skilled enough to deal with that. When I was thinking about NHI, and I know I'll speak to Belgium a bit later, but the No Humans Involved, in 2010 or 11 or 12, I was working as a journalist in Belgium, and we had a scandal with, these job centers, places that find people jobs. And because unemployment is so much higher amongst people of color in Belgium as well. So the scandal that came out is that those job centers had a code that they put on the files that came in, and it was BBB, Bleu, Blanc, Belge. And BBB is usually used to mark high quality beef, so high quality cows in Belgium, like the whole, and they used it, so it's a referral to animals, but to the super high quality. But what they meant was that those were employers that only wanted white Belgian people to apply for the job. So the job centers applied this to be able to know we should not send people with weird names and all these things, right? So the reason why I bring it up is that indeed in this image of the human, and it expresses itself maybe very differently everywhere, it's this imagined white Flemish person in this particular case. So I was tasked to write an article about it, and I actually called the Minister of Labour to talk about it and ask for. And the thing, because he was on the phone and I just gave my first name, Olivia, that he was so sure that I was a white journalist and also from the Flemish Nationalist Party. So he just said, like, no, my comment is we want the industry to regulate themselves, and I just want you to reassure the Belgian people that we're not going to put any money into this, they should self-regulate. So I made him repeat it a few times, right? But so just as an example to say that the representation thing, while we know that it's nowhere near sufficient, it's almost the minimal condition for us to have a conversation about this minimal condition of life and life mattering. And I think that the young generation of, and my niece, for instance, she's 12 now, whatever, the fact that it's true, they were born when there was a Black president, we all know how insufficient that was. But it's, the basis of their dissatisfaction comes from the fact that they feel legitimate to even ask it. Whereas I think for a lot of our generation, it was more like we can't even fathom having a lot of us in powerful places, whatever that means. So we waste a lot of time in actually, you know, trying to claim some legitimacy to say whatever. But the thing is that if we mistake representation for a sufficient condition, then we end up in the neoliberal cluster, whatever thing that we look at, where everything looks different, but it's actually 100% the same somehow. That would be my,
Okay, great answer. Thank you, Olivia. Kojo, do you want to come in and add anything to that? I know you're also a big Sylvia Wynter fan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that, you know, Wynter's name has been raised already in the conversation. And first of all, thank you to everyone at BISA for inviting me. And it's great to be able to share this conversation with, you know, scholars as brilliant as Olivia and Adam. I think from what's already been said, it just really takes me to, you know, what I consider to be quite an ingenious example of political sloganeering that we get with the idea of Black Lives Matter. I remember having this conversation. We brought Alicia Garza, who was one of the founders of the US Black Lives Matter movement, along with Opal and Patrice, over to the UK in 2016. And I remember talking to her about, you know, like, was there a lot of thought that came out of this? Because it comes out of the end of a letter that was written following, you know, the Trayvon Martin killing, and that idea of, you know, our lives matter, Black Lives Matter. And I thought, was that, you know, was this seen as like, was there much thought that went into this being this kind of political slogan that would carry so much weight? And, you know, she said that it was, I mean, this was kind of like authentic and just kind of came out. But I think it really does, you know, it's really quite surgical and piercing at so many of the structural power dynamics that make the modern world that we exist in function. You know, it's not a coincidence that I think it comes from not just, you know, 3 Black feminist kind of activists, but also queer activists. And it comes when we think about, you know, what Wynter's talking about the difference between the kind of plethora and multitude of humanity that exists, and, you know, what she describes as the episteme of man that really emerges with European modernity, that kind of reduction, narrowing, and fixing of a particular manifestation of humanity as the primary and only legitimate form of what it is to be a human. You know, she uses that word man specifically in terms of its gendered orientation, and I think that idea of Black Lives Mattering runs directly counter to that whole episteme of man the Wynter is talking about. That so much of that particular European modality, whether you know, we think about, you know, structures of capitalist production, where we think about kind of, you know, Enlightenment philosophy, all rests to a large extent on the idea of the kind of disqualification and delegitimization of Black life, you know. And Wynter wouldn't be, you know, an Afro-pessimist who, I think, take that idea of an anti-Black world and kind of over-rarify it and make it, you know, the anti-Black world, as though that is the only struggle at all. I think Wynter's much more nuanced in terms of understanding how the unlocking of value in Black life also unlocks questions around gendered power relations, around heteronormativity, around capitalist production. And, you know, I think that's what the kind of Black Lives Matter movement has been taken up by this new generation of young people are either consciously or unconsciously picking up on. You know, I think there's definitely what Adam's saying is right. You know, we want to think about other you know, more substantive categories around Black pride or Black power as existed in the 60s. But I think this is something really ingenious about having such a basic request, you know, such a low level, you know, not that, you know, Black Lives Matters are important, just that they matter, but that such a simple request can be so surgical and kind of, undermining so many of the structures of power that frame the world that we exist in today.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kojo. I'm going to stick with you actually, because I'm going to throw in something that you threw out there as probably just meant as a pithy tweet and wasn't meant to have an afterlife. But it's interesting that you moments like this of where Black struggle is brought to the fore are often met with a kind of paradoxical pushback from people pointing out that, you know, white people also die at the hands of the police, and I think Kojo voiced a great response to this the other day. So to quote you here, you said, things that disproportionately impact Black communities don't only impact Black communities. Is it possible that the whole society might benefit from us breaking up our systems of prisons and police? So just to pick up on that, can we think expansively, I guess, about this from, again, like the Haitian Revolution onwards, and speak to what Black struggle has delivered for humanity, and how these contributions have actually been censored from our histories of liberty and justice and so on. And just to say, the point of this question isn't to imply that Black struggle only has value if it benefits, you know, white people, but to note that Black struggle can be seen as always a struggle for humanity, of which the broader achievements tend to be disavowed. So do you want to say anything to expand on that, Kojo? You muted again. Chrissy, is it okay to unmute Kojo? Oh, still on mute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah. There you go.
Brilliant. I mean, well, first of all, it's extremely terrifying to have your tweets repeated back to you in this kind of formal academic setting. Never happens again, because some of those tweets, written at like 4 a.m. in the morning. But no, in terms of what do we think is the kind of the knock-on effects of kind of Black struggle, outside of those categories. I think, what I was trying to say before is speaking towards that a little bit. I always like the idea that the American theologian and philosopher Cornel West came up with when he talks about the idea of the Black radical tradition. And he talks about that as being the kind of most acute investigation into the conditions of freedom that that is developed through the kind of Western philosophical tradition. And that, that's not because, I think Cornel West is trying to prescribe some sort of unique kind of insight to Black communities and Black political struggle, but because of the relationship between particularly the African American struggle being the interrogation of conditions of freedom by a population that, in terms of its actual legal status, is denied those conditions of freedom whilst existing within a society that predicates itself on the realization and manifestations of those freedoms. So that combination leads to a particularly refined interrogation of, well, what does it mean to be free if I'm existing in a country that is, supposed to be based on, life, liberty, and the freedom to pursue happiness, but yet I am in a legal status of bondage and subservience. And so that tradition, it is, of course, and I think this has been a legitimate critique in a way of the kind of over-focus of American race relations, in terms of how that negates, imperial race relations here in the United Kingdom or in Belgium or in Holland or in a lot of other places. Hopefully we'll get on to talk about that a little bit later. But there is also something about that particular combination of racial struggle within the country like the United States of America, which has meant that, as well as because America's the global hegemon, the struggle of the African American community has had ramifications far exceeding its own particular liberation. It has become the kind of preeminent language almost of kind of struggle and conditions of freedom. we saw that with the 1960s and the kind of consequences that came from the civil rights struggle, which spread everywhere from New Zealand, as you know, our colleague Robbie Shilliam has done a fantastic work in interrogating, to places like Ireland. You know, when we think about the relationship between the kind of resurgence of Irish republicanism following its own civil rights movement and its protests and its marches and Bloody Sunday, and how much that was inspired by the scenes that they were seeing from Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi in the United States in the 1960s. And so I think that, you know, we do want to think about, you know, what are the conditions of kind of people's ability to construct their own narratives of freedom, and how much do we draw upon this particular African-American tradition in a way that doesn't negate and elide the specific focuses and specific concerns within different countries as well.
Thanks, Kojo. Olivia, do you want to come in and say something to that question?
Yes. Yeah, so I had written down actually to stay with the United States for the moment, and the things we learn from it, and actually also if I trace my own consciousness about all the stuff that we actually have right to and that we should fight for, it's sad to some extent, but yeah, there's a sad realization that had to go through the US. The nice thing about it is that it's African-American experience to some extent, but it's true that it still stays very much locked into imperial thought to some extent as well. But on a positive end, like a concrete example I was thinking of was last summer, the New York Times Magazine project 1619, where, and basically the idea was to actually question the start of our narration of the beginning of the United States in 1776, and the call to actually move it to 1619. And then obviously there are historical reasons why that is problematic or not, whatever. But if we stick to the main point, was actually this idea of somehow displacing the image people might have of not just the presence, but especially the contribution of African Americans to the construction of the United States to present. And so the main article was about the contribution of African Americans to American democracy. So it was not just about the material contributions through plantations and everything, mostly also because, you know, so much of that was so forcefully. But then when, you know, to rejoin what Kojo is saying, when people whose freedom is so fundamentally not a given organize to then ask for freedom, the consequences was usually that provided freedom for all the other oppressed groups in society. And I think that for me is the quickest way to actually, you know, the usual Black Lives Matters, no, all lives matters, whatever, that you know, that platitude is so easily it's so easy to debunk. And you know, like it just makes us think, I think, about basically also what we mean when we say Black, but also the fact that we can mean many things with it if we wanted to. You know, people that try to push us in one or the other definition. But that I think, and that's something about solidarity within oppressed people then, I think, in general, which is a useful thought. Mary Baraka once said, being Black is not an ideology, or it's not even a moral stance necessarily or automatically. And I think Cornel West also mentions something like that. But it's a relational thing, that there is an exceptionality from being in a particular relation to oppression historically and in the present, that is such a source of thinking and acting upon freedom and knowing it. And like, so for me, that's a source of expertise that comes from a position and not necessarily from an identity. And so in that sense, I have no problem on centering Black life. And I have to say that, especially spending time in South Africa at the moment, but also on the African continent in general, I think there is a scope for many of us located in the West, especially also Black people. How do we make sure that we translate that into also centering those Black lives that are maybe not in an everyday contact with white lives like we are in the West, and how that in the most weird ways is somehow also cut out of this conversation. And, you know, obviously, you know, observing all the different Black Lives Matters, but also the reactions to COVID and everything worldwide. It's a very interesting, different experience to see that here, where people are literally saying the numbers of our dying are much higher every day, day in, day out, than even COVID combined in many different countries. How do we react to that when we try and make sense of these exceptional times? So that's what I would bring here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Adam, do you want to follow up on that question at all before we move on to the next one? Are you, Chrissy, could you unmute Adam? Yeah,
Sure.
There you go.
Just, I guess, very briefly to go back to Kojo's tweet, which I thought was really important as well. And this is something I guess Kojo and I and some other colleagues have been thinking through as well, which is the way in which capitalism uses racism and nationalism to attempt to ameliorate the crises that it faces in order to try to gain popular consent for the way in which it functions. And so we can see the way in which, not just when it comes to the expansion of the prison and the police system, which is often justified because of the gangsters and the terrorists and the immigrants and the child groomers and all of these racialized criminal folk devils, but also the way in which we see the welfare state being eroded as well, whether it be the National Health Service, which it's just so overstretched because of all of these migrants and all of these there are all these health tourists, which is why we need to start introducing fees for these particular health tourists. Starting to bring fee paying into the National Health Service, or our housing system is under so much constraints because of the population growth coming from all of these migrants, or we see the way in which capitalism uses racism in these different ways to expand the power of its authoritarian arms and its more punitive arms, which therefore go to affect everyone, not just communities of colour, but also it uses racism to erode the victories that have been won by labour struggles, the victories of the health service and housing and all of these other things as well. And the erosion of them also uses racism to justify itself, which again adversely affects everyone, even if it does adversely affect Black people disproportionately. So understanding the way in which racism is fundamentally such an important component of capitalism reproducing itself and justifying itself, I think is another interesting way of expanding on Kojo's very pithy and useful tweets.
Great, thank you, Adam. I'm just going to skip a few questions and sort of carry on with the same theme and talk a little bit about visions for abolition and for defunding the police, which have suddenly become so strongly part of the political imagination, much more than they have been in the past. So just to get into this, I just wanted to set it up by saying, here in the UK, we've had more than a decade of austerity, and we've had this obviously as a political choice, which has been deadly and destructive for so many communities. But this has also involved cuts to police numbers. So we've cut around 23,000 police staff under the Tories. Meanwhile, the Labour opposition under Corbyn, portrayed as kind of hard left by the media, never actually stopped calling for police numbers to be boosted. So just as a way of getting into this, can you say something about the difference between the kind of cutting of police numbers under Tory austerity on the one hand and what abolitionists actually envisage when they call for the defunding of the police? And to follow that up, has the ground been prepared for left-wing politicians to start taking up the case for a kind of anti-austerity mode of police defunding, or do we have a really long way to go yet? So actually, I'll stick with Adam since you're not unmuted. But yeah, if you want to take that one since you're there.
I think this is one of the failings of the Corbyn projects. I think, which I guess in some ways is linked to this idea that there can be a progressive British nation, a progressive British nationalism, of which the nurse and the doctor and the teacher should be thought alongside the police officer and the prison guard, and they're all part of this kind of welfare state. And I think this is also a part of the quite successful propaganda campaign on the part of the police, beginning in the 1980s and 90s. This idea of community policing, this idea that the police are part of the community, and that we should think about them alongside the other emergency services. I was debating someone recently on some radio show, someone from the Police Federation, where they said, they're the first emergency service, but they're also the last, right? The police are like the sandwich in between the firefighters and the doctors. You can never really quite get there on time, and that everyone, you don't really call them first, you call the cops first, right? And so, I think this is a profound failing. But I think the other thing that's, I guess, is so deeply entrenched in British thinking throughout much of the world, is that police and prisons are some of the most efficient and effective and swift and sensible ways of solving social problems. Right? We don't have social problems because of inequalities, because of a lack of social or healthcare provisions, or a lack of decent housing or adequate jobs or access to education or anything like that. We have social problems because there are bad people within our society, and those bad people need to be punished. And if punishment won't work, then we'll just have to lock them away forever to keep the rest of society safe. And this is such a deeply entrenched common sense within so much of the world at the moment, that the abolitionist movement is really pushing it. I don't want to say they're pushing against the tide, but I think they've done phenomenally well to push back on this deeply entrenched common sense and argue that no, there are deep and often complex social problems why there's harm and violence within our societies, and there are progressive and productive and creative ways in which we can ameliorate those social problems that don't rely on turning human beings into cages.
Mm-hmm. Great. Olivia, do you want to come in on that question? It's a bit UK-centric, sorry. No.
I think the abolition question, let me put it like this. If I were to answer this non-UK-centric and stick with the police, and I know in some of the other questions you were also asking, like what's going on in Belgium, the funny thing is that's not even on the table. We are still asking for people to radically, and I know from living in the UK now that the UK could also use some of that, but radically changing the national curriculum. We're still asking to have more representation, everywhere, but simply also mystery shopper testing stuff when it comes to housing market. So those are the things that are now being debated in Flemish and Belgian parliaments. And the new thing is it's actually the left progressive parties that are still majoritarily white, like literally, that they bring that to the table as resolutions, but we are being run by the right-wing Flemish nationalists, also austerity-prone people. So the austerity thing goes hand in hand with much more blatant racist accepted policies from politicians, right? So I spent 2 hours today just listening to their debates. I almost cried. It's like, apart from being blatantly racist, it's also so mediocre, so many platitudes that I was shocked, like, shit, these are the people that are actually running our country. And I know it's not exceptional, and so I'm not necessarily making a comparison with the UK, but it made me think about, and the reason why I'm so excited about this moment, apart from being extremely tired and everything that comes with it, is especially this idea of abolition, and abolitionism as a way to make space for what we need to get rid of, rather than just simply always asking for reformations left and right, or tiny changes. And I think if we try and think of both at the same time, then we can look at this moment as what do we need to get rid of, and then creatively think what are the alternatives, the really alternatives that we're gonna try and come up with, or that we already came up with and now we're gonna remember, and what are the things that we still need to add. So the stupid representation stuff, it doesn't necessarily fall into the abolitionist logic at the moment, because it's still the bare minimum that we might need just to be able to even raise abolitionism to some extent. But then what we need to get rid of, obviously the statutes and the toppling is something that made us really happy. In Belgium, obviously, still littered full of Leopold II everywhere. So we're getting rid of them. But again, a minimum condition. But in terms of abolition, and I think the police and carceral system has done a lot of work for us to, let's say in the context of thinking about international relations or international development, I've started to think also about what is it in international relation that we should start thinking about in abolitionist term. And for me, for instance, it's international development work, aid and development, just the word aid, because it's so deeply racist. But we've been trying to make it slightly better by doing bottom-up, organic, blah, whatever. So for me, that's how abolitionism is very powerful, but it's also obviously a learning curve because many of us have been trained in just trying to tweak left and right rather than say, what can we really do without? And for me, thinking that we can actually live without prisons and the police is a very powerful thing because we've been socialized so much into that.
Yeah. Great. So I'll pass that question on to Kojo. So that, I mean, the question going the last one, obviously, about the difference between simply cutting police numbers and abolition in a meaningful sense. But I wanted to throw in as well a final question, which is something that I suppose has been playing on my mind quite a lot, and I feel a bit pulled in two different directions in a sense. So I wanted to think about the fundamental ethic of abolition, if you like. So in Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's terms, she says, where life is precious, life is precious. And I just wanted to ask whether this is in some ways in tension with the expectations and commitments of anti-fascism to reclaim space through direct confrontation and through pushing for real consequences for fascists, basically. So if I could just go to Kojo with any thoughts on those abolition questions overall.
Well, thank you. I think, to start off with the immediate question that you invited us to respond to in terms of the difference between the kind of anti-austerity Theresa May cutting of police numbers with the demands that are being made by the police abolitionist movement is gaining real traction in ways that, even 6 months ago, I wouldn't have assumed possible. I think, you're talking about the difference between kind of crude economic calculation based on, a kind of neoliberal fiscal policy and a movement that's really trying to reframe the conditions of the social. And so I always like the idea that you hear people who really work on abolitionism, both of prisons and policing, really push forward, which is we're not just abolishing prisons, we're not just abolishing police, but we're abolishing the kind of society that needs prisons or that needs police. And that immediately historicizes these institutions that have come to be seen as pre-natural. The idea of abolishing the police makes people start to think about, well, when were the police invented? What was the social and economic conditions that required the establishment of kind of metropolitan and then kind of national police forces? And, so all of a sudden you start to think about the urbanization that came about as a result of enclosure within the United Kingdom and within kind of continental Europe. You start to think about, the kind of reframing of plantation slave societies within the southern states of the United States of America and all of these kind of origins of the police force. And I think we also start to think about the mutation of the police over the last 50, 60 years, pretty much since the end of empire and the end of kind of, what we might consider kind of symmetrical rival warfare between global empires and global nation states. We start to see a real blurring of the military and the police force in terms of, tactics, in terms of technology, in terms of methods of surveillance. The police force that really emerges by the time we get to the turn of the millennium is very, very different in places like the United States and the United Kingdom than the kind of friendly Bobby on the beat that, we imagine in the 1950s who it brings you your pint of milk in the morning, and I think that kind of mutation of the police force into these highly organized, highly draconian, highly militarized forces has made us really start to think about, is this the right the right institution to address a lot of these social issues around poverty, around mental health, around a lot of around sexual violence and all the things that we often still use them for. So I think that when you mentioned a little bit about, well, does this clear the space for left-wing politicians to take forward the case of abolition? I mean, in the UK, I'm not sure how many left-wing politicians there really are left who might take that forward. So I'm not overly optimistic, but I'm really heartened by the idea, the way that this conversation has started to be introduced into the national discourse. This isn't something that, I mean, you're frankly seen insane if you said so, a year ago. This is something now that we really do have to think about, especially in a situation in which we are going to have a retrenchment of public resources, and we are going to have to reframe the social in a certain extent, following COVID-19. And I think we don't want to ignore the way that this racial uprising has emerged within the context of COVID-19 and the global pandemic, and how that's heightened a lot of those already existing tensions. I think that now we are in a space where, those conversations around where are the police, what do they do, why do we fund them, have started to become, really important. And so, that's really what I respond to that.
So, any thoughts, Olivia, on the idea of there being a tension between the basic ethic of abolition and a kind of anti-fascist sentiment?
So I think I've made a decision at some point to focus more on the racism that is in progressive circles. And I use the term progressive very loosely. Probably not how we would like to use it, but let's say self-declared non-racist circles. And the reason for that is because they're the majority of society, and they're the places that they are the ones that actually occupy the places of power that create the whole system that we're trying to dismantle now, right? The other reason why is also that the biggest everyday damage of racism does not necessarily come directly from the extreme forces in our society. I'm not saying that they're not related, because they are, but so in that sense, if we had to choose, or if the tension there, I would invite, I think, a lot of and I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I'm answering the thing that comes to my mind. I would often invite a lot of people that have decided to be actively anti-racist, and I've noticed that a lot in the UK, but also in Belgium. Often that translates into be very active against the fascist forces in our society. I just think that we need a lot of energy, and then I think the abolitionist energy is, in that sense, maybe slightly more urgent even. Because the really uncomfortable aspect of the racism discussion is not necessarily discovering whether you're racist or not, whatever, but it's very much this realization that we have to get rid of the societies that we have, that we're committed to, that we've been finally accepted to some extent or not. That's the painful thing, right? So that's why, for me, I actually think in the long term, the abolitionist route is a much more destabilizing, but also much more, radical one. And also, I think there's so much still to learn from that, or about that, what that could mean. And but probably the answer is obviously not either or. I do think both need to, because I know that whatever I'm seeing in Belgium today is a direct consequence of deeply fascist forces in our political fields since the 80s or before, right? So it's not detached, and we see the many other examples, obviously. But so very vague answer, but I think somewhere there was my answer. What I wanted to say to this is that the more difficult one might be actually the abolitionist one, and not necessarily the anti-fascist one, because anti-fascist language is something that somehow there is more agreement there, even though fascism is still everywhere.
Adam, any thoughts on that?
For me, I feel like perhaps there's less of a tension between abolition and anti-fascist politics, and maybe slightly more of a tension within abolitionist politics itself, because I think that anti-fascist politics has never been about relying on the state, right? Relying on the police and prison system to crush fascism. It's always had to be grassroots movement against fascism, whether that be the Spanish Civil War or the Battle of Lewisham, right? It's never relied on state power and its machinery for locking up the fascists, and so I think that having a grassroots anti-fascist movement in that regard doesn't necessarily conflict with the kind of the position on police and prisons that people like Ruthie Gilmore and others have. But I think the other important point is I think that abolitionists like Ruthie Gilmore or Angela Davis and others don't think that we can abolish prisons until we've overthrown capitalism. I don't think either of them, or indeed anyone, thinks that overthrowing capitalism will be a peaceful process. I think they will understand that to be a violent struggle at one point or another, because of the state's monopoly on violence and capital's violent power. And so, taking that into consideration, I think maybe the tension is more about within abolition itself. Because in order for us to value all human life, at some point, a violent struggle will be necessary in order to get to that place. And I think for me, that's where the contradiction lies.
Great, thank you. So we're just about out of time, but I wanted to leave it on a high note and just go back to the question that I was going to ask you about what is the most uplifting aspect of this current Black Lives Matter mobilisation, whether this is in the UK or in Belgium, and how do you think it differs meaningfully from past mobilisations? So Adam, if you just want to do a short kind of snappy answer on that, since you're unmuted.
Okay, so yeah, very quickly, I guess it's the largest anti-racist movement in British history, massively young people, but also there have been anti-racist mobilisations, like those massive solidarity marches in small towns and villages in rural England and Wales, for the first time possibly in their entire history. And so I think the fact that it's spread to so many corners of England and Wales that we've not seen before, and the fact that it's these mobilisations are organised by people who consider people like me old, I think are probably the most inspiring things.
Great. Kojo?
I think similar to what Adam said, seeing Black Lives Matter movements pop up in, I'm from the north, my dad's from South Shields where he lived, you see him through struggles are in the northeast and the northwest. That's been pretty remarkable. And I think also the kind of the framing of the demands that are being made, that this isn't young people talking about, discrimination, but they're talking about expropriation. They're talking about material violence. They're talking about the way that structures like the police and prisons and immigration services impact on Black lives. They're not just talking about, somebody was mean to me at school the other day. They're talking about material struggle, and that's really, really exciting. And then finally as well, I think that the fact that these questions are really being front and stage at a time in which, at some point there is going to have to be real reframing of the society that we live in following coming out of this post-COVID-19 crisis. And I think that having these questions around structural racial violence and the histories of empire front and center is going to have real impact on some of the way that we face some of those questions coming out of this crisis. I think they might have real impact on the kind of on one thing about an international level, on the kind of credit and loan systems that are provided by the World Bank and the IMF for countries as they're coming out of the post-COVID-19 crisis and the debt crisis. Is it going to be politically possible, in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement to impose the same kind of structural adjustment programs that they imposed in the 80s and the 90s on those countries? I'm not so sure in this particular moment. Is it going to be possible in terms of the UK for the Home Office to impose the same type of draconian migration discrimination practices on healthcare workers. They tried to do that very recently, you know, with the NHS health charge, and got pushed back because of the context of post-COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. So I think that, you know, as key questions are being asked about our society over the next, you know, few months and a year, the fact that there has been this really radical anti-racist global struggle might really change the answers that we would have had otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kojo. Olivia, final words?
I have to do it quickly and snappily, like you said. I think what I'm most excited about, and it's difficult even to say at a time of COVID, right? But I'm most hopeful about the fact that we are having a conversation about life and the possibility of life. And what made that possible, I think, or what drew people attention, is that the pandemic drew in people, especially in Western Europe or the US, who had maybe not have to think about life in and of itself on such a large scale. Mm-hmm. And so what then becomes possible is actually that we can immediately move from the stupid stereotype, I'm not so nice to you, I have prejudice, whatever, to we are literally talking about not just the possibility, but also the quality of life, but also survival and anything that comes from that. So, and that's also why I'm so excited about the abolitionist language into that, mm-hmm. because, and maybe I'm naive, but it would be so nice to be able to skip all the language that we've been trying to explain for the last 20 years in my case, and then move on straight away to something more radical. And that's a challenge for us as well, I guess, to mm-hmm. at least be ready to have that new language ready in detail, because mm-hmm. it won't be enough anymore to say, you know, anti-racist legislation where, you know, you can't say something bad or discrimination. It's not about that. Mm-hmm. So I'm excited about the conversation about life. And I just hope that we won't forget about that. So.
That's great. That's a fantastic note to end on.